welcome to the Fall 2013 Martin Olaf Sabo Symposium, one of a series of these sorts of events that we've held over the past several years, where we brought together students and faculty and staff from here at Augsburg with policymakers and legislators and leading citizens to have important conversations about topics that are of interest to all of us. We have a very special evening tonight. I think it's very certainly timely that we are having this conversation just a year after a momentous election here, a night after another momentous election, but it's certainly a year ago. The difference a year makes, especially for a couple of the topics we're going to talk about tonight. And in many ways, for me, thinking about this issue as it fits into the work of the Sabo Center for Citizenship and Learning is how, in fact, we engage, especially our students, in thinking about the possibility of being involved in shaping policy. And I think what we had tonight are three wonderful examples of folks who fought for things they cared deeply about and made that change happen, and I think are going to give us some real both inspiration but also understanding of how that process works. I want to say a special word of thanks to Professor Gary Hesse, who, as you know, is the Sabo Professor Emeritus and retired just this past year, still around and about. We're certainly grateful for that. And Gary was, in fact, really behind this whole idea of the Sabo Symposia and active over the past several years in helping to organize them. It is always a great privilege to welcome Martin and Sylvia Sabo, who are here somewhere in the front. There's Martin and Sylvia. Thank you for your inspiration. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Mr. Tom Berg, who in fact is now the Senior Fellow in the Sabo Center, who is helping to pick up the work in organizing. He will be our facilitator this evening. So Tom, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and I would add my welcome to the group here. I hope tonight we can have a fun and lively and interesting time. We've got lively, fun speakers and lively, fun topics. So now the rest of it will be up to you when we get to the discussion period with hopefully good questions and things. The focus tonight is on the topic of change and making change happen and how it happens. I had the privilege of serving in the Minnesota legislature in the 1970s with then Speaker of the House, Martin Sabo, and it was a period where there was a great deal of change that came about. I've written a book about that change, and what Professor Hesser grabbed me at over there at the beginning was there are a few copies in back that he would be happy to sell you, and I would be happy to autograph after the program if you wish to have them. But what we're going to talk about tonight is experiences of three very talented people who have made significant change happen in Minnesota recently. They're going to share their experiences and thoughts about how they've been involved with this, how they came about getting involved with this, about the process of change, the role of other groups, the role of individuals, people they have worked with, problems they had to overcome to bring about change. And what I'd like to do is I'm going to introduce all three of them right now, and then we will continue 1, 2, 3 with their comments, roughly 10 minutes apiece, and then get into those fun and interesting questions and discussions. Our first speaker will be Senator Scott Dibble, who is a New York native, attended the University of Minnesota in St. Thomas, studied German and political science. He is my senator, and I know from watching and being a constituent that he is an excellent senator. He served one term in the House and is currently in his third term in the state Senate. He became involved in politics in the mid-1980s. He started working on issues of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender communities and HIV/AIDS. He's also played a very key role in the Minnesota legislature in transportation funding, pension issues, housing, and environmental matters. He played a very key role in defeating the marriage amendment to the Minnesota Constitution in the 2012 election, and Senator Dibble was the chief author of legislation allowing same-sex marriage in 2013. And he will talk on the general topic of his experiences dealing with marriage. The second speaker will be Kate Knuth, who is a Minnesota native, who's attended as a Fulbright Fellow, I believe it was, at the University of Oslo, did her undergraduate work at the University of Chicago, has a BA in biology and in philosophy, which I think for those of you who are students is a pretty interesting combination of science and liberal arts. Kate served 3 terms in the House of Representatives. She is currently getting her PhD in conservation biology at the University of Minnesota and runs the Boreas Environmental Leadership Program at the university, at their Institute of the Environment. She is also a citizen member of a state body called the Environmental Quality Board, and tonight she's going to talk about her experiences in change and climate change. And our last speaker then will be Uwe Mesa. Lo siento con mi español, señor. My pronunciation's a little shaky there. Uwe spoke no English when he arrived from Mexico in 2003. He graduated from Arlington High School in St. Paul, the first person in his family to graduate from high school. He was also the first in his family to go on to college and to graduate, which he did in 2011. He graduated from AUGSBURG College in 2011. He has gone on to co-found Navigate, an organization which assists students in accessing higher education and scholarships regardless of their immigration status. He recently served on the Citizens League staff, and he also, I looked on the blog at the Citizens League, he also put out something he was talking about called Policy and Tequila that has some potential interest down the road here. He'll also hopefully stick around afterwards to answer some questions that, if they go on longer. He's received many awards, including the Oatley Award from the Mexican government and the Immigrant of Distinction Award from the Minnesota Dakotas chapter of the American Immigration Lawyers. He is currently a liaison person with the Minneapolis Public Schools, and tonight he's going to discuss his experiences with change in the Minnesota DREAM Act. Again, each will have about 10 minutes, and then we'll get Q&A, and the Sabo scholars from Augsburg will be around here with microphones, so you won't have to queue up at a microphone or anything. And we're going to make sure that students get the first crack at the questions, so I hope all of you are thinking about some of those, because we have this wonderful panel tonight, and I think we can cover a lot of ground, and you should feel free to ask most any topic that you're interested in relating to these matters and about change, and I think with this panel you've got a pretty good shot of getting a pretty good answer. So let's begin with a warm welcome to Senator Dibble.
Well, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Augsburg College, and everyone for the invitation to be here. It gives me great pleasure. Actually, we're celebrating the one-year anniversary today of the defeat of the anti-marriage amendment in the state's constitution. So, yeah, I'm kind of Scandinavian by heritage and try not to get too emotional, but I can get pretty emotional about that particular subject. I had a moment earlier today, as a matter of fact. So I need to say it's a tremendous honor to be in the presence, of course, of Tom Berg and Congressman Sabo, and Jack Davies is with us as well, former fantastic state legislator and judge. So thank you, Jack, for being here, and your beautiful wife, Pat. I'll try to cover this quickly. There's a lot to talk about. So, my friend, State Representative Phyllis Kahn is here. So glad to have you as well. I'll try to cover this quickly. There's a lot to talk about. I'll try to save some of this for the question and answer period as well. But when we think about marriage, I just wanted to start off by reading an interesting passage. I actually am now officiating marriages. Did 2 last weekend within an hour of each other. That was pretty awesome. And I read this little passage as part of the ritual and ceremony, and it's from the decision of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. So a little bit interesting reading to do in a ceremony, but it really encapsulates and captures very nicely what the discussion of marriage is about. It's from the Goodridge versus Department of Health by Massachusetts Supreme Court Chief Justice Margaret Marshall, who was, by the way, a Republican. Marriage is a vital social institution. The exclusive commitment of 2 individuals to each other nurtures love and mutual support. It brings stability to our society. For those who choose to marry and for their children, marriage provides an abundance of legal, financial, and social benefits. In return, it imposes weighty legal, financial, and social obligations. Without question, civil marriage enhances the welfare of the community. It is a social institution of the highest importance. Marriage also bestows enormous private and social advantage on those who choose to marry. Civil marriage is at once a deeply personal commitment to another human being and a highly public celebration of the ideals of mutuality, companionship, intimacy, fidelity, and family. Because it fulfills yearnings for security, safe haven, and connection that express our common humanity, civil marriage is an esteemed institution, and the decision whether and whom to marry is among life's momentous acts of self-definition. So we, as we were debating this issue over the course of a number of years, we really were able to talk with some fair level of precision about what exactly marriage confers in a civil sense upon individuals who have access to it. In fact, we have an organization that goes by the name of Project 515 here in Minnesota. And the reason it's called Project 515 is because a student, a graduate, or a law student over at the William Mitchell College of Law undertook a project to really figure out how many rights, responsibilities, obligations, benefits are conferred just by the civil act of marriage when 2 people get married, and there were 515 of them that they found. When DOMA was passed at the federal level, Paul Wellstone commissioned a similar examination by the General Accounting Office and found something like 1,500 in federal law. And of course, we know that it really constitutes those basic elements, as the Chief Justice illuminated, of our civil, legal, and economic relationships to each other. Really forms that foundation in a real legal sense and strengthens our bond to each other and our ability to provide and care for our families. But there's also that element of community and family support that we need to pay very close attention to. It's acknowledged through ritual and celebration, provides a tangible, formalized, and in many ways also intangible structure and context for us in which we carry out our daily life and our relationship and how we relate to one another. I like to, well, I'll get to this in a minute. As far as passing the marriage bill earlier this year, we really can't discuss that without really discussing many, many decades long of debate on this particular subject. It, of course, was most acutely and literally expressed in the context of the campaign that we had over those 2 years, from 2011 till the election in 2012 in November. And I'm sure all of you are very, very familiar with that debate that we had in that election. But actually, this whole conversation was going on since long before that. And actually, when the governor signed the bill on the Capitol steps with 7,000 people on the Capitol lawn, it was pretty amazing. I wore a button that a good friend of mine who had been leading the effort to pass domestic partnership benefits led as far back as 1988. And this all started off in that discussion about how do we just simply try to enact those elements, compartmentalize and parse out small elements of what it means to strengthen our relationships, to start to have that conversation. And so this was going, we started, of course, everyone's familiar with the LGBT civil rights movement going back to Stonewall and even previous, and really talking about civil and human rights on an individual basis. but we were starting to talk about who are we in relationship to one another and our families, and we really started this conversation about civil unions, about domestic health care benefits, those sorts of things. And so in 1988, City of Minneapolis, with the leadership of Sharon Sells Belton, who was then on the city council, Brian Coyle, a city council member, openly gay, one of the first openly gay city council members in the country, we were able to successfully pass, actually, health care benefits and some civil union benefits for the citizens of Minneapolis. At that time, I was working as a corporate guy, Fortune 500 company, and there was a real active effort among the corporate sector as well. People were coming together. They were coming out. Remember, this was in the age of HIV/AIDS, and the GLBT community was under a lot of pressure, and we knew the only way to battle HIV/AIDS was to come out, be present, and let the rest of society know who we were and what was going on, because this was a crisis that was going on, largely out of view of the rest of the country. So even in the corporate setting, we were coming out and engaging our corporate leadership in these kinds of conversations. So there was a real movement among Fortune 500 companies, and actually it was a little difficult at first, but a lot of companies very quickly were seeing the wisdom of treating their employees well, and also opening up as a consequence marketing channels to whole new commercial opportunities that they hadn't thought about previously. Unfortunately, after the city passed that ordinance, a citizen filed a lawsuit against the city of Minneapolis and succeeded in quashing the extension of those benefits. And the only thing that survived was the ability simply to register yourself as the domestic partner of someone else if you were an employee or worked in Minneapolis or lived in Minneapolis. Really wasn't worth the paper it was written on. It might form a little bit of a legal toehold if you had some sort of legal dispute, but it was a nice little certificate you could hang in your house. It didn't have much real practical benefit. Then fast forward a few years, and Jesse Ventura was elected, and Jesse Ventura was very kind of, live and let live, kind of libertarian, and he was actually pretty straightforward on this particular subject. As a matter of fact, he even hung behind his seat in his desk in his office a very, very elegant and classy and tasteful neon sign that said, "Love is love." He was all class, that guy. But it was beautiful, because that was about that reflected some comments that he had made during the campaign, which were basically, why shouldn't people be able to go visit the person they love in the hospital? Love is love, and government shouldn't be interfering in those sorts of things. And so he was really a very, very great governor on these issues, and he had simply extended into union deliberations the offer with no conditions attached, the ability for state employees to gain health care benefits that they could extend to their domestic partners. Unfortunately, what that triggered was a huge backlash in the state legislature, and in fact, that particular union contract, rather than being ratified up and down, which is the normal process, was completely replicated in total in state law with that provision stripped out. And it was really a very, very difficult moment for me. It was when I had first come to the legislature. Previous to that, the legislature had passed its own version of a DOMA law banning the ability in state statute of same-sex couples to marry one another quite explicitly. It had been understood previously, but it was made even more explicit. Backing up just a little bit, in Hawaii, folks might know that Hawaii is in special session right now, and it's just about to pass the right for folks to get married to each other, and it's pretty amazing that they're in special session specifically for that purpose. Neil Abercrombie, their governor, is very, very focused and dedicated to getting this done. But it's really Hawaii that kind of started this whole national backlash that we saw starting in 1993, the Hawaiian Supreme Court, and then there was more legal process, and then definitively in 1996, the Hawaiian Supreme Court said not extending the right to marry is unconstitutional under Hawaii's constitution. And that triggered the first round of constitutional amendments that were passed quite easily in a number of states. In succeeding election cycles, more and more states took up these constitutional amendments to simply bar the ability for people to get married in their own state's constitution. And it was very vexing and very difficult time. And of course, it was, in many cases, kind of a cynical electoral ploy that was being used by the likes of Dick Cheney and Karl Rove and others to benefit a larger electoral strategy, presidential politics, congressional politics, and state legislative politics. And it was successful because it really mobilized a conservative base at the time. Minnesota actually had its own brush with those efforts in that era. When Michelle Bachmann, my esteemed colleague and good friend, arrived on the scene in the state Senate, I had the pleasure of serving with her for a few years, and she really rode in on that agenda of passing this anti-marriage amendment on the state's constitution. And we actually came quite close in a couple of instances prior to 2011 of getting that amendment placed on the Constitution. At one point, we only had a 3-vote majority DFL in the Senate, so that means any 2 conservative state senators, DFL state senators, could have voted with the entirety of the Republican caucus and placed this amendment on the ballot. We avoided that. It's an interesting story, and we can get into it later. But then came, of course, the 2010 election. And that was, of course, a wave election, and the DFL majority in the Senate was swept out for the first time in 38 years. And we knew, bam, it was placed on the ballot, and we lost that year. But they gave us 18 months to fight it. That was probably their first error. And how am I doing on time? All right. I've lost track. All right. We'll go through this fairly quickly, and we'll have more conversation in just a little bit. So that was an 18-month campaign, and that was a really, really big mistake on their part to have passed that effort so early on in the legislative cycle, because we only vote on constitutional amendments in even-numbered years. So they very easily could have waited until late in spring of 2012 and only given our side a few months to mobilize. In fact, that had been the case in almost every other state. There'd really only been a 3, 4, 5, 6-month campaign. In that instance, it's really, really hard to gather the capacity, the structure, and really implement a decent campaign plan to fight something that's more likely than not to pass anyways. It was also juxtaposed against that particular year in 2011, in which we had a fairly alarmingly extreme Republican majority that had taken over, particularly in the Senate, which was very, very outside the norms and tradition of the Senate. A flat-out refusal on the part of both bodies to compromise with the governor to establish a budget. We went into state government shutdown in 2011. So the only crowning achievement of that particular legislative session was this amendment. Really negative, and we hadn't done the basic work of the people, which is balancing our budget and establishing a tax policy and just paying for our normal services. And that impasse, of course, continued on past our fiscal year, and we went into shutdown. And so people were really, really turned off by the negativity that was emerging from the legislature, both in their failure to do basic work and then doing something that really divided people against each other. And it really sparked kind of a massive coming together of a lot of folks on a very, very broad basis. The campaign itself was a very intensely interpersonal, interrelational campaign, conversations based on the subject of values and what really matters to people on a personal one-on-one basis, was really operationalized in a way that campaigns like this had never been able to do before. People talking to each other in their churches, in their union halls, in their towns, all across the state of Minnesota, because a very broad coalition of all kinds of different organizations came together very quickly to unite on a common set of values around love, commitment, family, responsibility, freedom. And we were able to do the research to really surface what really unites us and what sorts of things should we really be talking about to mobilize and motivate folks so they could see their own story in this whole subject rather than seeing this as something that was different and new and outside of their own experience. We related to people's own experience in a really authentic way. And we did not talk about, very interestingly, rights and benefits, all these legal issues that I spoke of earlier. It was really about that authentic connection that people make with each other in the context of marriage, falling in love and having their family come around them to support them. People understand that. Start talking about legal structures. We start talking about discrimination and prejudice. You're not really connecting folks and motivating them to vote the way you want to. And that was a key learning how to talk about this subject and learning how to make it very, very interpersonal and relational. It was, I think, a brilliant learning that we were able to have and then operationalize in a massive way with 70,000 volunteers having raised $13 million, almost all of that money from individuals in small amounts within the state of Minnesota. So it was really more of a movement than a campaign in the classic sense. It was a fundamentally, authentically, broadly multi-partisan effort, and it included all sectors of the state of Minnesota, whether it was business, labor, arts, education, you name it. There were people and organizations from every walk of life represented on that coalition board. And then very quickly pivoting into the legislative session on November 6th when we won that and beat that amendment, we quickly had to go about the business of helping Minnesota and helping the political leadership of our state properly interpret what the election was all about. The election was a referendum on a particular subject, and it was important to persuade our political leadership that it was really imperative to take a positive step on this subject. That's what the voters were expecting of us, and we had to make that political case. And so we started doing that very quickly after the election, within the first couple of weeks, really laying down the markers, helping them appreciate and understand the volume and level of engagement that Minnesotans had around this issue, how it turned the legislature on a partisan basis, and how young people in particular were really looking at us with intensity and saying, so are you going to live up to the values that you've articulated in the context of this election? I think we made that political case, but we didn't have the votes. It took a long time to build the votes in the legislature. And that was about taking that incredible campaign, that grassroots campaign, that movement, and just pivoting it and just engaging folks who were engaging each other and persuading each other to vote no, to train all that energy on their own legislators that represented them, and telling their own stories and letting them know what they expected them to do. And we ended up with a pretty strong bipartisan, barely bipartisan, but bipartisan, which was important, vote, of course, in the House and the Senate. In the Senate, we had one Republican. I'll take it. And we had 4 Republicans vote for the bill in the House. So I think I'll wrap there, and we can have more conversation. We'll hear from Kate and Uwe, and look forward to the conversation. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me and the invitation to speak here at Augsburg. I just moved in across the way, so I walk through your campus several days a week on the way to my bus, so I might see you around. It's great to see Martin Sabo. I was telling a story when I first ran, this small story not related to climate change, but one of my favorite personal Martin Sabo story. When I was running for office the first time, I was young, 24 at the time, 25 when I was elected, and this seemed like a weird thing that you would elect a young woman from the suburbs, where I was definitely younger than the average person. And at my endorsing convention, Congressman Sabo was thanking the district for their support, and he ran into my dad in the bathroom before he gave his speech. And my dad said, "Congressman, I know my daughter's running for office. I know you can't endorse her, but if you could just let them know that you ran for office when you were very young." And so he mentioned to the crowd that he had run at age 22, and I think that might have helped seal the deal with that endorsing convention. So I'm here tonight to talk about making change related to climate change in 10 minutes, and now that I've told my story, 9 minutes. And so I'm going to give you a few pieces, and then we'll open it up to the questions and conversation at the end. But I want to start from the place of how I view climate change. And it's an issue that's not an easily defined, narrow issue, and most issues aren't, but I think more than almost any other issue, it really permeates our entire economy and way of life. And so there's a lot riding on it. And we're going to have to deal with it in some way or another. And my hope is that we choose the way we react to the challenge of climate change instead of having to react after the fact. And I decided, as you heard, I studied biology and philosophy, and I had grand aspirations of being a research scientist. And I was finishing my master's degree in England in the early fall of 2005, and as I was writing my thesis, I was flipping back and forth to reports about the biggest news in my home country, which was Hurricane Katrina hitting the Gulf Coast. And not great for writing or your mindset in terms of actually making an academic argument, which at that time seemed quite small compared to what was happening on the Gulf Coast. But I think there was something planted in me in watching climate change happening to people who were not ready for it and whose government was not ready to help them handle it. And when I came home from England, I thought about going on for a PhD right away, but I decided to run for office, and I ran for the House. And people ask why I ran. There's a few reasons. Climate change is amongst the three. And that was a real reason why I decided to step up and run. Because when you're 24 years old and have a couple of shiny degrees under your belt, of course the thing you should do is put yourself forward for elected office. And so that's what I decided to do. And of course I didn't talk about climate change the whole time. That wouldn't have worked in my suburban district. I spent a lot of time knocking on doors and listening to people. I got a lot of people like yourselves to knock on doors and listen to people to help me get elected. We had a field organizer from the DFL who I think was slightly less experienced than me. And I had a campaign manager who was much more experienced than me, and together we somehow organized a group of people to make it happen. And I got into office, and within the first 2 months, we passed Minnesota's nation-leading renewable energy standard, 25% renewables by 2025. We passed major conservation work. We passed community-based energy development, several other things. And so I was like, this policymaking thing is so easy. We can just pass stuff. But if you look back at that history, there was a lot of work happening. As Senator Dibble could tell you, the renewable energy standard had been introduced for at least 6 years. It had some of its roots in fights even earlier related to nuclear power and shifting that. It had people organizing in all sorts of different ways to force Minnesota to have this conversation in a serious way. And there was things happening federally as well. But I think what changed in the 2006-2007 election is that it became an issue that people voted on. But when I say it became that passive thing, is people made it something that legislators were forced to vote on, and legislators hung their hat on it as they were campaigning. This is something we're going to commit to do, and people love clean energy. It's like, it feels good. People don't like coal. It's unhealthy. It turns things dirty. It's, causes asthma. But people love clean energy. And so to talk about it in a positive way and to have organizers from the environmental community, from the clean energy advocacy community, from a lot of different backgrounds talking about these issues and making it a campaign issue, I think was a very key part. And there was a couple key things that I thought were really interesting in this organization. Will Steger and Fresh Energy, who's heard of Will Steger? So this makes you feel old in Minnesota. Okay, Will Steger, famous polar explorer, like best polar, most famous explorer, I think, in the state for sure, in the country, arguably. And he and a woman from Fresh Energy decided to go around and have conversations with people who might not agree. They didn't go talk in Minneapolis. They went and talked in Fergus Falls, in Grand Rapids, and they generally talked in churches. And so they talked in more conservative areas in churches, and they drew crowds of 500, 1,000 people. And when you're someone running for office and you see 500 people in your district show up to talk about something, all of a sudden it becomes a much more interesting conversation. And that was an intentional organization that happened by some very strategic people who worked with a much wider group of people to have conversations with people that may or may not have agreed, but they were at least willing to listen and figure out a way forward together. So 2007, 2008, kind of banner years in terms of climate change policy here in Minnesota. And And then it started to shift. Things started to get harder. And we came in 2009, 2010, climate change, and you can read histories about why this has happened. It was not accidental, it was intentional. Creating doubt about climate science, making it into, in some ways, more about identity politics than actual good information, which makes it a much harder issue to make progress on. And I think lessons we could learn from the marriage equality conversations and wins is how we can bridge those divides again in climate change. And so we started to have to say no in climate policy in this state and in this country in certain places, in certain ways, after we sort of reached the pinnacle federally of a bill passing the U.S. Congress and then not the Senate, and then it all sort of falling apart, and we almost pushed it over the line of having a global agreement in Copenhagen in 2010, but it didn't quite happen, and then things sort of fell apart, and we sort of went into some very challenging years. But I think we're starting to come out of that, and so climate change is not a fight that has been won. It's not a fight we're sure we're going to win, but it's a fight that's going to be happening for the rest of humanity's future. So we have to figure out how to make it happen. So people are shifting from the conversation of how do we say no to stop that, to keep the progress we've made here in Minnesota, to shifting to how to say, how are we going to do this together? And in Minnesota, I wasn't in the legislature this last year, but I think the Minnesota Solar Standard and the community solar policy that passed was the result of a really strong coalition of labor, of youth climate organizers, of the clean energy community, of businesses who have an interest in this, coming together and very disciplined around the conversation of we want to invest in Minnesota's clean energy future. We want to build our positive future together. And that was, I think, very powerful and very positive. Nationally right now, there's kind of two big fights that are coalescing in terms of organization. Who's heard of Keystone here? Okay, more of you than Will Steger. This is interesting, interesting for me to see. When Keystone started being discussed, I was like, I don't want to deal with that. I don't want to have to figure it out. And then it became so obvious that that was what the conversation was going to be. And we could talk about why it was chosen in various ways, and you can agree or disagree, but you, I think, can't disagree that it's been an effective conversation. And the fact that this decision has been delayed for as long as it has been delayed and may not happen, I think is a very strong endorsement. It basically shows a really strong, powerful impact of organizing at the community level in a lot of interesting, creative ways. The other conversation is divestment. Has Augsburg been having a divestment conversation? You say yes? Yeah? No? Yes? Some. Okay, this goes back to, has roots in the apartheid movement, but basically trying to take away the social license of fossil fuel interests by divesting from them. But I think the exciting part about divestment is thinking about how do we then invest in a sustainable future? How do we use that money not just to take away the license of the social license of fossil fuels, but invest it in the kind of future we need to build to really be able to deal with the impacts of climate change. And there's a real positive way to think about how we bring our power together around building our future. And so I want to leave you in thinking about organizing and the actions you can take around climate change, about how do we use our power, whether it's our money, whether it's our voices together, whether it's the stories we tell, whether it's the things we buy, how do we use those to build the future we need together. And it's going to take building the clean energy future, maintaining the social relationships and structures so that we can rebuild and come back when there are the inevitable climate disasters we're going to be seeing even more. And then how do we live and travel in ways that use have less dependence on fossil fuel and carbon-producing sources of energy. So with that, thanks again for having me. I look forward to the conversation.
Kate and I are using stopwatch to keep us on time. Again, my name is Juventino Mesa, and I graduated from Augsburg in 2011, but it seems like it's been a long time. So it's great to be back and seeing so many familiar and also new faces. Thank you for inviting me to speak to you about the Minnesota DREAM Act. It is also an honor to share this stage with Tom Berg, Senator Dibble, and Kate Newt. I also want to thank Sylvia and Speaker Sabo for bringing your leadership back to Augsburg. When I was a student here at Augsburg, I was a Sabo scholar, and I had the opportunity to intern at the state legislature for Representative Carlos Mariani, and then I interned at the Citizens League. And after I graduated, I got a job at Citizens League. And so if you get a chance to be part of the Sabo Scholars, you should, because it's a wonderful experience, but it also opens up many opportunities for your future after Augsburg. Now I want to talk about the DREAM Act, which is the reason why I was invited to be here. And the DREAM Act, I would use two names for it. Many of you know it as the Minnesota DREAM Act, and others know it as the Prosperity Act, but it's the same thing. But before I go into any detail, let me give you an idea of what you will hear tonight about it. I will tell you what the Prosperity Act is, why it was needed, how we passed it, who was involved, and I hope that throughout this conversation you see the role that young people all over the states had in making this a reality. So first, the Minnesota DREAM Act is law, and it was signed by Governor Mark Dayton, and it was passed by the state legislature this year in 2013. The Minnesota DREAM Act added provisions to recognize certain undocumented youth as Minnesota residents for the purpose of higher education. A student who went to high school for 3 years in Minnesota, graduated from a Minnesota school, or got their GED in Minnesota, registered with the Selective Services, and provides proof of applying for change in immigration status when it's available, will qualify for the Minnesota DREAM Act. The Minnesota DREAM Act allows qualifying undocumented students to apply for a Minnesota state grant and pay in-state tuition if you go to a school like the University of Minnesota just across the street. A student may carry their state grant to any public or private school, 2-year or 4-year school anywhere in Minnesota. And the Act also allows public colleges and universities to use private money as part of their financial aid packages to undocumented students. Also, qualifying students may apply for reciprocity tuition if they want to attend a school in a neighboring states. So we're the 14th state to pass in-state tuition in the nation for undocumented students, and only the 5th one to include state financial aid. And that's a big deal because for many years, the State DREAM Act version or language didn't include financial aid, and so this was a great year for us. So why did we need a law like this? There are many reasons, and I'll touch on some briefly. Some is because many immigrant students in Minnesota do not or did not have access to state financial aid, federal financial aid, federal loans, many scholarships. Many students were dropping out of high school because they didn't think they could go to college. I personally dropped out of high school because I didn't think I could go to college because I was undocumented and I was told I could not go to college. And many other students were in the same situation. I think another reason why we needed this law was because there was no information throughout the state that students could access and learn how to go to college. We know that many first-generation students struggled in reaching college. Undocumented students are more often than not first-generation students, but their families also might not have any knowledge of how to navigate the system in going to college. And many families also felt or feel fearful of what might happen if their undocumented student applies to college, gives out information about the family, and so on. And I think one of the reasons we also needed this law was because I think for a long time, and I want to relate this to the LGBT movement as well, is because many undocumented students have felt fearful just to talk about their experience, and I think that is the case with a lot of LGBT youth. And so I think in some way this is a law that also gives confidence to young people to reach out for their dreams, and I think that's really important. So how did we pass this law? This whole thing started in about 2011. Some students in South Minneapolis who wanted to go to college faced what I talked about. They didn't have access to good information about how to go to college. They didn't have access to financial aid, federal aid, and so on. But it took us more than 10 years to pass it, more than a decade to pass it. Why was that? Some of it is politics. We had a governor, a Republican governor, who was going to run for president, and obviously he didn't want to be seen as pro-immigrant presidential candidate. The DREAM Act actually passed in 2011, the legislature, with support from Republicans, but Governor Pawlenty threatened to veto, so it didn't pass, and we ended up passing something else very similar. But we passed it in 2013, and I think one of the reasons we passed it was because Governor Dayton was elected in 2010, and he had said he would support it. Obviously, in 2010, 2011, both the House and the Senate were controlled by Republicans, and we knew that they were not going to put any bill like this forward. Come 2012 elections, Democrats take over the House, the Senate, and obviously we still had Governor Dayton there. And so that made it a very friendly environment for something like this to pass. But it didn't just sort of come along so easily because Democrats were in power. And I think this is sort of my whole point. If you listen to anything I've said, this is my point. Young people throughout Minnesota made this happen by putting themselves out there, talking to legislators, lobbying legislators for many years, speaking to the governor, whatever we found him. And also, we created alliances. And while we knew that, and I would be lying too if this was not about also how do we make white people care about brown kids? We know the achievement gap in Minnesota is one of the worst nationally. And talking about the achievement gap, we knew it wasn't as helpful, and so one of the things that we ended up doing was to talk about data and use data as we were talking to legislators and students were talking to legislators. And so one of the things that we also did was sort of create a diverse coalition of stakeholders around Minnesota who would support it. 2 examples. When I was at the Citizens League, we worked really hard to get the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce and the Education Minnesota, which is the state's largest teachers union, to work together. If you follow those 2 groups, you would know that the chamber and the union do not get along on many things. And so this was really important, that we could tell a story of 2 groups that don't agree on anything, that were agreeing on this one thing. Another thing that we had to do was to make sure the DREAM Act was broad enough to keep and gain the support from 3 big institutions in Minnesota. Private colleges and universities, the council, the University of Minnesota system, and the Men's-Q system. If we lost the state grants in the negotiating part of passing this law, we would have lost the private colleges, because private colleges were already awarding private dollars to undocumented students, or some were. And so in this law, without a state grant, then there was nothing really for the private colleges. So it was really important that we were thoughtful about keeping this law broad enough to keep all these stakeholders together. And the last thing I'll say is that the DREAM Act really came from young people. Young people were leaders throughout these many years, more than a decade, and many of us came out of this movement, and we're doing many different things. And I think that's also important. When you get engaged in something and you put yourself out there for something that you care about, I think it also helps you prepare for your future. So the DREAM Act is now a law. It's working and students are benefiting. About 260 students applied this fall, even though we only had 1 month to promote the application process. And the Office of Higher Education has been tremendously helpful in this whole process as well. We obviously need more work. We obviously need to do more work, like making sure that more students benefit from this in the spring and beyond. We need to pass comprehensive immigration reform so that not just students have this temporary protection, like deferred action, but that so that our families also have some sort of protection. So I'll stop there, but I hope that you learned a little bit about what the DREAM Act is, why we needed the law, a little bit of background of how this was made happen, and that I hope you see that throughout this, young people have been instrumental in making all of this happen. I cannot finish without thanking Augsburg for being one of the most environmentally friendly schools. And also because I think Augsburg is one of the best schools for LGBT youth, or LGBTQIA. But I also want to acknowledge that Augsburg is the best private college, not just in Minnesota, but in Wisconsin, Iowa, North Dakota, and South Dakota. So I thank you for your commitment to all students, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, so I was wondering for Juve Mesa, what data was used and how was it used? You said data was used, but could you be specific, please?
Yeah, So one thing that we had been doing for a long time was to bring students to the Capitol and talk about their stories, which was really important. But one thing that I think we've realized over the years is that not just for the DREAM Act, but also, for example, in the marriage fight, was that sort of doing data or just looking at data at how people react to different things is important. And so in the whole deal about the DREAM Act, you know, I said earlier, you know, how do you get white people to care about brown kids? Sort of a joke in my head, but I think it's also an important aspect of this whole fight. And one of the things that we used throughout this year was, if you look at data in Minnesota, the number of people retired in the next 10 years will be greater than the number of kids in school. We will not have enough workers to replace all those people who retire. Neither will we have enough, or along with that, we will also not have enough people to take the jobs that are being created. So this sort of, to us, this became a workforce issue. Obviously, we also talked about the achievement gap. And then we also talked about the fact that in the next 10 years or so, the population of white students is decreasing dramatically, while the only populations growing are students of color, mainly immigrant communities. And if you think about that, all of that together, and then you also add the whole equation about achievement gap, Minnesota is one of the worst states in educating students of color, period. And so if you think about it, and then you think about the workforce in the future, and then to us it was really important to tell people, if you don't if we as a state do not make sure to educate all students in Minnesota who want to go to college and give them the opportunity and support them to graduate from college, we will not be ready for what is coming in the next 10 years. So that was sort of how we used it. And also, along with that, we made sure that we, as a coalition, sort of were telling this same story throughout the state and writing op-eds and so on. And that was sort of how we used it.
Hi, I'd like to congratulate you on an excellent program. It's inspiring to hear the stories. I note that you talked about 3 different initiatives that you worked on, and there are many initiatives out there in the larger society. So just take as an example, immigration reform, which would be important, global warming, we're talking about education and educational opportunity, healthcare, and I'm wondering if, based on your experience, you are apprehensive that the efforts of young people might be sort of diffused and undermined if there are too many projects they're working on, and if there's a way to sort of coalesce behind 1 or 2 that you think are the prime initiatives, or if this is like, this is America, we just go and everybody do what they want to do and hope that it falls in place.
A good question, and I'd like the panel to answer that, but I want to make sure that everyone knows the questioner is also a former member of the United States Congress, Dave Mingy, and a former member of the appellate court, or still a member of the appellate court, in senior status in the state of Minnesota. But go ahead, fire away here.
Are we taking on too much, too fast, and diffusing our efforts? It's an interesting question. I don't think so. I mean, I just look at, we're getting a little crosswind here. I just look at the accomplishments of the last legislative session, and they are, I mean, we passed marriage, which was tremendous, and everyone is focused on that, but we did many other significant things that make people's lives better, support the middle class. start creating an economy that works for folks, starts turning our ship around on addressing our environments and preserving our natural resources. Seems like we had a lot of capacity to do a lot of that work fairly effectively and fairly well. I just think about the election we just had yesterday in Minneapolis, and the big story that's being written today and tomorrow that we're going to read in a bunch of newspapers is how engaged young people were in those elections, and that's really coming out of the 2012 elections as well. There seems to be something happening, a lot of energy, and young people engaging in issues, and that's translating into elections and politics. And maybe we'll get back to a time when we were a state on the move. A legacy that's been left to us by a couple of the great people in this room here. So I think the answer is no.
I think building on that, politics is not a zero-sum game. It's sort of one of those things momentum matters and relationships matter, and they build on each other and snowball. And I think one of the most amazing things coming out of the marriage campaign is relationships that would never have been there but for this fight. I mean, people literally sitting in a room together whose jobs were a Republican legislator sitting next to a person whose job was to run an organization trying to defeat Republican legislators, working together on a common issue. And I don't know what that story is going to look like into the future of our state, but I think those relationships don't just disappear when that fight is over, that fight shifts to something else. And I think federally, I've been part of a group called the Young Climate Leaders Network for the last year or so, which is 25 people, 20 to 40, work on climate change in different capacities. And talking to some of the people who are really trying to run some of these, do some of this organizing from the national level, are trying to learn how to work with each other and build on the successes and the lessons and the relationships in these other movements. And so I think once you start doing something, it gets easier to do more. And I think individuals have certain capacities, but I don't necessarily think societies have a limited capacity in the same way. And I know there's a lot of young people who aren't engaged yet, and we could just keep adding more people, hopefully. But I think the relationships and the organizing knowledge, the political knowledge, and the experiences can be shaped and moved into making different impacts depending kind of at the time and what's most pressing.
The only thing I'll add is that I think you should engage in things that you want to do, and I think you also should get to know yourself so that you know what kind of things you want to do in the future, who are the people you want to associate with. And the other thing is that not everything happens in governments. So are there things that you're interested in that are outside governments? For example, one of the things that I want to do next is, now that we passed the DREAM Act, I want to get private colleges to have policies that are friendly to undocumented students. That's not inside governments, and that's outside. That's in private colleges that rule themselves. So that's my point. Get involved in things that you want to do, know yourself, and if you want to be involved in politics inside governments, great. If not, there are many other places to get involved in.
Thanks all three of you for coming to speak to us. We really appreciate it. And Senator Dibble, you talked about one of the most effective ways you had of getting through to people was the familial connections and the bonds that people create when they make marriages. And saying that now to climate change, what's the most effective strategy or data set or connection that you make with people that makes climate change resonate most and makes people want to make change and build change? So what's the most effective strategy?
I wish I had this answer. I'd be a really highly paid consultant in DC or something. I think, frankly, there's several reasons why I think we're starting to see a shift back away from the sort of strong denial, the identity politics that climate change has been mired in the last few years. Part of it is the climate's changing, and the connection is being made that Hurricane Sandy being the big one, but Mark Seeley, who is our state climatologist, talks about how we have 100-year floods and much more regularly at the same time that much of the state is in drought. Things are weird, and people know it, and people who are in rural areas and on the land know it even more. So I think that's a really big part of it. And there's a few different messages, but one that I really think taps into what's best about our country is that we step up and figure out how to make it work, even when it seems really hard. And to say that Americans can't deal with the challenge of climate change denies what's best about this country. And so there's a hopeful message in that, and it's saying that we need to do this together. I think there's also really thinking about how we work in our local areas in terms of cities or states. Yes, I would like to see national policy. Yes, I'd like to see a price on carbon. I think that would drive a lot of change. But I think cities are where the level of government that has to make it work for people, make sure the snow is removed, make sure the power is on, make sure the garbage goes away. And it's also where a lot of the work can happen to actually make progress on solutions. And you don't have a lot of the partisan stuff that you can get in the legislative arena. And so I think climate is changing, and linking the weirdness that's out there to climate change is really important, and to people's experience of what's weird. And then tapping into American ingenuity and us coming together to solve these, to figure out how to deal with this challenge.
This is for Juventino. In terms of the social aspect of passing the DREAM Act, how did you go about assuring families that their immigration statuses of their children and themselves would not affect the students and their families?
Could you repeat the question? Sorry, I missed the first part.
So, in terms of getting the DREAM Act to be passed, the social aspect of getting the families to be more involved, how did you go about assuring the families that their immigration status, whether it was documented or undocumented, would not affect them, the families, and the passing of the DREAM Act? Does that make sense?
So that was, I think that was a big struggle for a long time, because even, I remember 2006, 2007, Facebook was around by then. And one of the things that I remember, and it was weird, or it's weird now to think about it, but then we had talked about, well, can we create like a Facebook page and trying to connect people in that way? And then I remember people were talking about, no, because we don't want people to have easy access to all the organizers and sort of identifying them and their immigration status and all of that. So that conversation happened for quite a while. But I think so in 2007, I said earlier, the DREAM Act was passed by the legislature. Governor Pawlenty didn't want to sign it, so it didn't become law. But one thing that we did, some students, we founded this organization called Navigate. One of the things that we did with Navigate was that we knew that students weren't getting information. We knew that their families were fearful, or our families were fearful. And so one of the things that we wanted to do was, can we get undocumented students who were in college to go out and talk to other undocumented students and their families about going to college? And so that was not radical, but there was a lot of power in sort of, because counselors can tell you whatever, right? You can go to college, all of that. But there is a different impact when you have an undocumented student in front of you if you're undocumented. And I think it changes the conversation and it changes how you think about it and all of that. And so, so it was that. So it was, can we put students in front of other students and their families? That was one. But another one was, and I'm talking about navigate still, obviously that's not sort of the whole picture of whatever, that everything has happened. Another thing that we did was to develop presentations and sort of make sure that families were getting information about how to go to college and all that. And one very important aspect of this presentation was to tell families and students that there are federal laws against colleges sharing their information. So that was really important. Using what was in place, so like FERPA and other Supreme Court rulings that protect student privacy and their families. And so that was another tactic that we use in telling families, if your undocumented student applies to college, she is not going to get in trouble. And the family is not going to get in trouble, and immigration is not going to come after them just because they apply to college. And that was really important, and it's sort of like a story that we tell every day, all the time, because that myth still exists, because it's never been true that if you apply to college, immigration is going to come for you, but the belief is there, and that's what we've been trying to change, and that's some ways that we did it.
Let me ask, there we have a question right down over here. And while we're going there, I'm going to ask you all, just raise your hands on how many would be interested in working. I'm going to ask climate change, civil rights and same-sex marriage kind of thing, or immigration as high on your list of priorities. I'm not going to ask anybody to comment, but just to get a rough show of hands, I'd be interested. Let me do that first.
Can you pick more than one?
Pardon?
Can you pick more than one?
Sure. You can pick more than one, Kate said. But high on your list. How many would put high on your list climate change? It's something you really might want to get out and work at. Okay, how about civil rights, same-sex marriage issues? Okay, how about immigration issues? All right, pretty even split. Yeah. Very good. We got a good program.
And as it happens,
all right, there are questions down there.
I worked on all three
Okay,
myself.
so poor
legislatively.
people are affected by climate change the most, but considering that they leave a much smaller carbon footprint than others, how do you approach this issue, and has getting them on board been effective?
I need to have that one.
Could we repeat that one again? I'm sorry.
Poor people are affected by climate change the most, but considering that they leave a much smaller carbon footprint than others, how do you approach this issue, and has getting them on board been effective?
Do you want to take
So if I understood the question, how do we get low-income folks engaged and work on climate change? Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay. Actually, there is a tremendous effort and very successful organizing going on in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota and across the country to really connect issues of social justice, economic and racial justice, and environmental issues. Really a real environmental justice movement that's going on. And it's pretty effective and been pretty exciting. As is true of any set of issues, how folks get engaged and get motivated to spend time and money, and anytime you're working on something, it's time away from your family. It's time that you devote. It's energy that you devote. It's the challenge is difficult and complex, whether you're talking about low-income communities or busy students or middle-income folks or folks with a lot of money. It's really about connecting self-interest and connecting passion and connecting values and creating, identifying solutions for problems that are attainable and reachable, and then that can be built upon in subsequent efforts. For example, in Minneapolis, there's a discussion going on right now about the garbage burner that's adjacent to downtown. Good people disagree on the merits and benefits of the garbage burner, but a lot of people think that the garbage burner actually puts out quite a few toxins and we could handle our whole solid waste stream in a completely different way, and they want to expand it, and the plume from the garbage burner goes up and lands right in North Minneapolis. That's tangible, and that's something that can be actually identified, and the problem can be solved in other ways, and the problem can be structured in a way to target specific policymakers and people who are in the decision-making seat for action. And so it's really about structuring the movement and the work in a way that people can access in ways that they have capacity to do, but really engaging people around actual problems that affect their lives, that touch on their values, and have real, like I said before, real solutions to real problems. And those are the building blocks of building larger movements for change and connecting people together around the work.
And thank you for the question. I think that there is definitely a really important justice issues in climate change, and thinking about who's contributed to the problem in terms of lower income, both within this country and then internationally, people in groups versus higher income contributing a much larger, much more to the problem. And this is something that people in environmental work and building the climate movement think about a lot and haven't figured out the best answers for. And I hope we have more people like yourself to help us ask these questions and then really figure out how to answer them, or live in ways that answer them. There's not an easy answer on this. And there is unfortunately, I think in some ways, environmental and environmental justice movements, and they overlap, but not always. And I think figuring out how to make sure they work together more effectively really matters. On the policy side, you can design policies in all sorts of different ways, but constantly asking that question of, is this just for lower income people in the policy design, I think is a really important question to be asking. And I think the exciting thing is the solutions to climate change is in a lot of ways about democratizing our energy system. And right now, it could go, when you think about the risk of what you're investing, that gets put on to the ratepayers. It gets put on to the people who are paying for the electricity or the gas, but really electricity. And when you start democratizing it, there's less risk for all of these people. And lower income people pay a higher percentage of their income in energy costs than others. And so taking advantage of that sort of democratization of energy, I think, is a really exciting way to think about bringing low-income people in. But I think it's something we really need to work on. I'm not going to say we have the answers for it, so I definitely appreciate the question.
I think those answers showed it was a very tough question, and nobody's got a quick, easy, simple answer to it. But proving that Augsburg is very much related to lifelong learning.
The question is to Scott. To pass a marriage bill, you had to get legislators who came from districts where the anti-marriage amendment had passed by sometimes significant margins. How'd you get their votes?
And please be as specific as possible to that question here, Senator Dibble.
So the question was how to get legislators to vote for the marriage amendment in those districts where the marriage amendment passed by significant margins. And there's no one answer. Every single legislator was put on a list, and the effort to get their vote was tailored specifically to them. It's called a power analysis. And, every legislator gets a file or whatever, and everything you can possibly think of about that legislator goes into that file. what motivates them, who motivates them, what is their, what are their basic value structures, what do they bring to their job, et cetera, et cetera. And so, it was one by one, it was climbing up a very, very steep hill, getting one vote by one vote by one vote. There's a fantastic case of Joe Radinovich up in the Crosby area, up in the Iron Range. And he's a young guy, really young, and I think his district voted for the marriage amendment by a factor of 60 or 70%, pretty overwhelming, pretty conservative area. But he said, how could I not vote for the bill? This is a core value. If I lose my election on this basis, so be it. I'm here to do something that matters, and I'm here to live up my values. And I'm a young person, and this is an issue for which my generation has settled the subject. And so some people just came to this understanding that this is a core value, and I'm willing to risk my political future, and that's fabulous. That doesn't happen in a lot of cases. This is a democracy, and so so a couple things had to happen. One was a ton of engagement from their own constituents, so that they could really understand that sure, folks may have voted for the amendment, but there's still a lot of people out there who would engage in a positive sense. A lot of polling research was done. How many folks, and really drilling down in fairly intensive and in-depth ways. So a lot of really good polling was done. And people were asked and pushed pretty hard. If your legislator voted for the marriage bill, how much would it matter to you in deciding how you were going to vote for that legislator? And the data was fairly compelling. The people who cared the most and would vote against that legislator, it showed in almost every district actually. They would be voting. It was pretty small for starters, and it would be people who had never voted for that legislator in the first place. That combined with the experience that we're able to really track with some level of detail, that over time the people's feelings about this, in the negative in particular, diminishes. It dissipates pretty quickly because people can see with their own eyes and with their own ears and what's going on around them that all this calamity that's predicted just does not come to pass. And people just move on. They move on very quickly. It just becomes a part of the backdrop. People, come out, people living out, they're living their lives with openness and honesty in places where you wouldn't expect. There are people out now all over the entire state of Minnesota getting married. It turns out to be kind of boring, not a big deal. And it's a big deal to people getting married, but people get married every day. It's not actually that big a deal. And so, it shows that it just kind of dissipates and people they just move on and start caring about other things. So it's, it's that engagement, making sure that there's constituent engagement, pressure, whatever you want to call it, working with folks, doing that connection, that heart-to-heart connection, so that legislators really come to understanding the values that are at stake, what they're elected to do, making a larger, especially in terms of the DFL, that larger political argument that we have an emerging generation who's looking for their political home. We do this, not passing this bill comes at greater risk in the larger political scheme than not passing it. That we would stand to lose an emerging base for the larger DFL effort. And so, part of it's persuasion, love, engagement. Part of it is just making the political case.
There we go.
Hi. Oh, hello. Hi. Okay, so I was wondering this is for Scott. I was wondering where you draw the line between the interpersonal approach of assimilation when it comes to marriage equality and the liberation of encompassing all queer identities in a movement, because a lot of times we talk about marriage equality as the forefront of the LGBTQIA movement, whereas marriage equality doesn't really affect all of the acronym. Most of the time, it mostly just affects the L and the G and maybe the B. So I'm just kind of wondering where you would draw the line between assimilation and liberation.
Well, it's an interesting discussion that was held. It was actually a much more intensive discussion in the LGBTQIA movement. back when I was first becoming a part of that effort. It was the assimilationists against the separatists, or there were other strands and efforts. I don't think. First of all, marriage isn't the sum total of what's important to LGBT people. There's still a lot of stuff that needs to be done in terms of societal change, kids, seniors, health disparities. I mean, there's just, we haven't even passed basic non-discrimination on a federal basis, and in most places it's okay to fire people for being gay, or deny them housing, or police can treat them differently, and it's still perfectly legal. First of all, it's sometimes these discussions are more useful in an academic setting and not out in the policy arena, because the simple fact of the matter is that there are problems. Politics is about finding solutions to problems, and lack of access to marriage is a significant problem for a lot of people. And it was, and it really actually was one of those issues that, sure, I talked about what was going on back in the 80s and that, but the intensity of the issue was really ramped up by our opposition, and that needed to have a response of some sort. And they actually ended up, I think, handing us an accelerated time schedule for making these changes. And now we have 15 states. We're on the verge of 16 states, and probably going to get about 5 or 6 more in the coming year. But we work on these issues. They affect a lot of people's lives for the better. But we keep working on a number of other fronts as well. So it's not a zero-sum game. We work on a lot of issues. This one happened to come to the fore in these last 15 years or so. I think it's actually moving towards resolution fairly nicely in the next 5 years or so. But we need to make sure that we're talking about how we address all people and their ability to thrive and succeed, no matter who and what they are.
And I'll add one quick thing, if that's okay. One of the things that I realized for a while, especially when I was at Augsburg, but also when the whole marriage conversation was happening, was that oftentimes we work in silos. So if you are working on immigration, you do that, and if you're doing LGBT rights, you do that over here. But one of the things that I realized in this conversation about immigration and marriage, and also about liberation, is that you can pick what you want to do, and that if you want to get married, you can now. If you don't, you don't have to. But that there are many other things that we have to work on, and so Scott mentioned a few of them. But as we talk about immigration, this marriage equality conversation was really important in the immigrant community here in Minnesota for 2 reasons. One, we worked really hard also on the marriage fight or the amendment fight, and then on passing the bill, because we knew that in places like California, where they passed Proposition 8, more often than not, immigrant communities were blamed for the failure of marriage equality. And so many white organizations that were pushing for marriage equality sort of took many funds out from community groups that were supporting immigrant groups. So that was sort of something important for us. We didn't want to not be engaged in this fight, because if we lost, we in some way were gonna see some blame placed on us. And so we wanted to be engaged, and sort of, if we won, and that was great, but also we wanted to make sure that people wouldn't see us as sort of the cause of why we didn't win. The other one, and again with this whole question about liberation, is that DOMA is now gone, yay, at the federal level, right? And so that defined marriage between a man and a woman. And when it comes to immigration, that was also really important, because if you were a straight couple and you were a U.S. citizen and you married someone else from somewhere else in the world who wasn't a U.S. citizen, you can petition the person and bring them here and live happily ever after. Not really, but if you were gay or lesbian or whoever you chose as your partner, you couldn't do that. And when it came to immigration, and so this marriage question to us was also really important because there are many immigrants who have lived with partners who are a U.S. citizen and someone who is not. And so this was really critical. So it was important for us in Minnesota to be engaged in the conversation as immigrants, but it's also been important that as we talk about immigration reform, we also talked about LGBT issues. And now DOMA is sort of that solved some of those issues, but it was important. And so I know many people who sort of don't want to get married and all that, especially when they're in binational relationships, but many are getting married now because they can now petition their partner and travel outside the U.S. and see their families. And that to me is really important and gives me goosebumps because many of us have not been able to travel outside of the U.S. for many years and haven't seen our families for many years too.
Let me say we started out talking about change and how it comes about. And it seems to me, some of my observations of this is that one generation involved makes quite a difference, and youth bring about a lot of change. One thing that I wrote about in my book, and when Martin and I were there, it was a whole generational turnover in the Minnesota legislature back in 1973 that led to this explosion of change. I think similar things have happened potentially in the Minneapolis city election right now. And you see it with these panel members, and I see it with all of you students here that are interested in this. And I think that's absolutely wonderful. I think we also saw that government matters. And this is not necessarily a plug for Andy Aoki's political science classes or history classes from other professors here, but government matters. And we talked quite a bit about, we didn't define the distinction too much between the Constitution and laws that the legislature passes and governors sign. And we talked about the three branches of government, not in a civic sense. Well, remember the conversations about Ventura and Dayton and Pawlenty and what the executive branch does and what the legislative branch does? If you're interested in change, it helps to know something about all of those things, because all of these panel members talked about that. And the same thing about coalition building. They all talked, topics were different, but every one of them talked about the importance of coalition building. And they also talked about the use of power. Some of it was money, some of it was votes, some of it was geography, but various kinds of power. And lastly, the whole topic of federalism came up. They didn't use the word, but it was a role of the government in Washington, the national government, and then the role of the states, the 14 states that Uwe talked about and the immigration thing. Scott talked about it, the marriage equality. Kate talked about it with in some of the climate change legislation and standards that were passed. All of those things, it seems to me, are part of change, that if you're really interested in bringing about change, you need to know something about. And I think tonight's panel brought it out very well and very effectively and very clearly. And I want to thank, on behalf of the Sabo Center at Augsburg, our panel, for the good job they did. I want to thank all of you for coming. We appreciate it very much, and we hope you'll attend the next seminar we put on down the road a ways. Thank you very much.